Start again. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Trading Without Borders podcast with your host, Tomobi. Today, I have two interesting guests with me here, two development experts as I call them here with me. And we are going to be having some insightful discussions about trade within Africa or the AFCFTA. And they have written a book called Borderless Africa, a Sceptic's Guide to Trade in Africa. So we're going to be speaking about that. And I have here with me Mr. Andrew Moe, the Senior Economist at UN Economic Commission for Africa. And I also have Mr. Francis Mangeni as well, who is the advisor on economic integration at the AFCFTA office, AFCFTA Secretariat in Ghana. So thank you very much, Mr. Moe and Mr. Mangeni. It's good to have you here with me. So I'll just let them also introduce themselves. So you have the floor, Mr. Moe, and I'll let Mr. Mangeni speak after you.
Well, good afternoon, Omobola, to you and your listeners. Yes, my name is Andrew Moe, and as you said, I'm a senior economist here at the Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa of the UN Economic Commission for Africa's regional office. So basically, we work on regional integration and particularly on the AFCFTA from this office. Francis, over to you. Yep.
Yes, Mr. Mangeni, you have the floor.
Yes, hi, Omo. Yes, my name is Francis Mangeni. I work with the AFCFTA Secretariat in the Office of the Secretary General. I have been there as a head of programs and trade promotion since 2020, and then after that I was an advisor. I was coordinator for regional advisors. And now I'm advisor on economic integration. I also worked with the African Union in the past and with the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa as COMESA for quite a number of years, for 11 years in fact, as Director for Trade and Customs. So I'm very happy to join you on this podcast where we'll be explaining or having a chat with you, Omo, on our book, Borderless Africa, a Sceptic's Guide to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Right.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mangeni, for that. So we are going to be discussing about the book Borderless Africa, a Sceptic's Guide to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And this is really, I'm really very excited about this because in my journey in this AFCFTA, I've had people, I always say that I've met the pessimist, I've met the optimist, and I've met the people that are just neutral. And the book here has sort of come to address concerns about, especially the skeptics who feel that the AFCFTA cannot really work in Africa. So we're going to be sharing more about that today. So just join us in this interesting journey. So I'm going to leave this. I'm just going to ask the first question and try to either Mr. Moe or Mr. Mangeni to answer it. So in your book, Borderless Africa, you mentioned in the introduction that Africa is swimming against the current with the AFCFTA. That says we're going against the grain. Can you shed more light on why the continent needs the AFCFTA? Thank you.
Francis, would you like to respond on that one?
Yes, yes. That's how we begin. You're perfectly correct. And the explanation for that is that if you look back to about 10 years ago, just over a decade ago, there have been movements around the world that seem to not like regional economic integration, that prefer, if you can call it, isolationism, or they prefer to go alone. For instance, you know about Brexit, how Britain decided to withdraw from the European Union after many, many years, many decades, following a vote there, which was narrowly carried. In the US, you had Donald Trump, who was elected, and then he proceeded to withdraw his country from a number of international arrangements. They had this strident position, which they still do, at the World Trade Organization, which almost paralyzed the organization. Now, on the other hand, you have Africa, which is actually doubling down on regional integration, which is saying that we need actually to integrate deeper and faster. And to that end, we have had the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been negotiated in a record time of under 3 years when the agreement was open for signature. And following that, it was ratified, it entered force in just over a year. That's in May 2019. And within again a year, we started trading on the AfCFTA. As we speak now, trade and investment is happening on the AfCFTA. Political will is high, morale is high. The private sector are gearing up to utilize the AfCFTA to follow up trade and investment opportunities. Therefore, that's why we say Africa is swimming against the tide or going against the grain. But the reason for this is actually very simple. Africa has no other strategic choice now, except to go really for the AfCFTA and to pursue deeper regional integration. You can say that after a long consultative process, Africa adopted Agenda 2063 in 2015, which is a 50-year blueprint, which aims for the Africa we want. That's one which is integrated, peaceful, prosperous, driven by its own citizens, and the internationally efficacious or influential. And it has 15 flagship programs to achieve this vision. One of these programs is to establish the African Continental Free Trade Area. So it has been a well thought out process in arriving at the decision that we need the African Continental Free Trade Area. But in our book, we really try to go into the details. We look at experiments, if we can call them that, about trying to foster economic integration and transformation on the continent through promoting access to markets of developed countries, to the European Union, to the US, and to other developed countries. And we try to show that actually this hasn't worked at all. The record's there for everybody to see. We try also to show how our engagement in the WTO over the years since 1995 when it was formed, well, have not been that fruitful, I would say. We have had some breakthroughs, like on special and differential treatment, but still it has been an uphill task to get our development agenda really on the negotiating table, and also to get exactly what we have been demanding for. We also look at, say, the global value chains, which are supposed to help small countries, especially, with their small companies, small medium enterprises, tap into the networks of the big companies. But we also show that this has been an uphill task. It's really difficult to break into these global value chains. They are quite opaque, they're highly regulated, and it's not an easy job to get into them. And on the contrary, then we show the economic significance of the African economy. It's a huge economy. Estimated that combined GDP of $7.4 trillion at purchasing power parity, easily making it the 4th largest economy in the world. We try to show how South-South trade, including intra-Africa trade, is booming, how these markets are more dynamic. They're not as saturated as those of the developed countries. And we argue that it's therefore better to talk up African trade, intra-Africa trade, and to tap into it since it is so vibrant and it's growing very fast compared to trade with other markets around the world. So I don't want to take too long on this introductory question. Maybe I can turn it over to Andrew to also chip in. But this is why we present this book in that context or against that backdrop.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Mangeni. Mr. Mo, do you want to also chip into that? Or
Well, I was just thinking of giving a personal perspective of why I personally am so in favour of continental integration on the African continent. And Francis just mentioned Brexit, and I happen to be a British national. And this is one of the reasons why I understand, a little bit better maybe the costs and potential losses of not integrating or integrating, because I believe that the United Kingdom made a tremendous mistake with Brexit. And I think those costs have become evident ever since we withdrew from the European Union. Now, that's not to say the European Union is a perfect entity in itself. It has its own problems and challenges, but it clearly is, the natural home of the United Kingdom to be trading more with its partners within its region. And I think if that's true for the United Kingdom, that is doubly true for African countries, particularly at the current juncture. So I think Francis highlighted the right points there about, the changing global situation. There's a lot more skepticism about trade and regional integrations. The multilateral system has been rather blocked over the last 2 decades. And so effectively, Africa's going in a different direction, perhaps from the rest of the world. But it's a very important process for the African continent. And in the book, we stress, the historic origins of Pan-Africanism and why Africa now needs to achieve deeper integration through the implementation of the AFCFTA.
thank you very much. You've both highlighted the fact that the difficulties we're having with breaking into the global value chain, and it is important for us to boost intra-African trade among ourselves. So I'm going to move on to the next one, and I will start with Mr. Mold. I know so why do you think that intra-African trade is grossly underreported? I know Mr. Mold has been no, there's been some informal trade going on, even if it's not reported. So why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, well, effectively, as you mentioned, firstly, informal trade has a very significant volume across the continent, and this is not registered in the formal flows. So the classic argument you will hear in many presentations is that Europe intra-regional trade is at 65%, Asia at 59%, and Africa just 15%. Those comparisons, we insist in the book, are very misleading. You're not comparing like with like, and there are a number of reasons we cite in the book for that being misleading. I mean, the first is on the African continent, a lot of the trade is informal, and the studies that we review there show that the figures can go from anywhere from 10 to up to 50%, and even more in some particular cases. So in West Africa, for example, within ECOWAS, trade between Benin and Nigeria, or Niger and Nigeria, has traditionally, a lot of it's been the informal route. So that's one reason. Another reason is a continental average can be very misleading. So if you look at the 3 largest economies on the continent, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, actually they trade less with the rest of the continent than your average smaller economy, African economy. So in East Africa, we point to the fact that many of the economies already 50% of the exports go to the African market. The reason why those 3 large economies trade less, well, in the case of Nigeria, it's because, of course, of your oil wealth and the fact that most of those oil exports are destined to outside the continent. Egypt's a different kind of case. They've been more oriented towards trading with the Middle East and Europe in the past. So just Nigeria and Egypt alone actually bring the continental average down a lot. And it means that the average is not really reflecting the economic reality of the vast majority of African countries. So that's another reason there. It's an important argument, really, because I think when people start on this comparison between Europe and Asia, it's misleading, and it leads policymakers to undervalue the importance already of the African market. So we stress in the book that our intra-African trade is already very healthy and dynamic in many parts of the continent, and that gives something that's positive for the AFCFTA to build upon.
All right, if I can just add, Mr. Omo. Yeah, so now the correct way, the question then is, what's the best way to talk about intra-Africa trade? So in addition to what Andrew has just said, we think that it's always better to disaggregate this trade, intra-Africa trade, to also look at the individual countries involved. Countries such as, for instance, Zimbabwe. You know, Zimbabwe has been going through a hard time since sanctions were imposed on it a number of years ago. But I was just there, training, local administrations on how to best utilize the AfCFTA. And it turns out that Zimbabwe's exports to Africa are 52% of their total exports, you see. So there's a country which has been going through a hard time, but look at how high its exports to Africa are compared to the rest of the world. Now, if you look at countries like Eswatini, exports to Africa are 80%. Of course, you can say Eswatini is a small country, it exports mostly to South Africa, but I've just mentioned Zimbabwe. Now we come to East Africa, countries like Rwanda, even Burundi, Uganda, Kenya. Their exports to Africa are over 40%. In some cases up to 60%, actually, yes. So it's important to always disaggregate and look at the importance of the African market to individual countries. Because as Andrew explained, if you don't do that, and you go by this figure we are tired of hearing, this low figure of 15%, 17%, then you reach this wrong policy conclusion that intra-Africa trade is minuscule, it's not worth paying attention to, when actually that's far from the truth. It couldn't be farther from the truth, really. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to suggest, that we really need to always try to disaggregate this and really describe the true significance of intra-Africa trade for most of our countries as a continent.
Thank you very much for this. I think this is a very important point that you have highlighted, and it is important for us, especially researchers and the rest of us, that when we're talking about intra-African trade, to, just like you had suggested, we should disaggregate and look at the countries individually. Because when you go to seminars, everything on intra-African trade, you keep hearing Africans, the volume of African trade, intra-African trade is low. And for me, it was when I noticed that Mr. Mold kept on, I think it was one of his posts, and was like, no, that's not true. I had to also do a deep dive to really research and see that, okay, it's not really as they say that it's low, and it is important for us to always look at the countries individually so that policymakers can come up with the right policies concerning this. Thank you very much. So we will move on to the next question, and that is, okay, I'll just leave it open for anyone to respond to it. And that one is, you mentioned that there is skepticism from some quarters about the AfCFTA that needs to be addressed. Can you explain why this is important? I'm really waiting for your response on this. So why do we need to address the skeptics of the AfCFTA? Thank you.
I could offer one piece of information to illustrate this, I think, which was declarations made initially by the national president of the Nigerian Labour Congress, who described the AfCFTA in 2018 as an extremely dangerous initiative, called it a radioactive neoliberal policy initiative. Now, we basically don't accept the premise of those kind of arguments. And in the book, we go at some lengths to explain that just because in the title of the African Continental Free Trade Area, there are the words free trade, we explain in the book at some length, it isn't really a free trade agreement. It's much more. It's, as Francis was talking about, the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. It's really about creating a continental market. And it goes far beyond a normal free trade agreement. And there's no sense in which it is neoliberal. And that's why actually we have a chapter there to discuss the intellectual legacy of Adebayo Adedeji, who was one of the Africa's most prominent Pan-Africanists and a big leader on continental and regional integration. So it is in no sense neoliberal, and it's that's why we feel within the continent the arguments haven't been won across all quarters, although what's to be welcomed, of course, is the level of political support and the degree of consensus that the Secretariat has managed to muster around the protocols, for example, because it's quite complex, of course, building a market at a continental level. And Africa, of course, has 55 AU member states. The European Union has often struggled with consensus with half the number of member states. So I think, you know, we need to appreciate that and reflect a little bit on it. And the book was designed basically to address some of the remaining criticisms of the agreement.
Yeah, so if I can also add, you ask why it's important to address these skeptics. Now, just building on what Andrew has said there, as I said earlier, the AFCFTA is really the only strategic choice at the moment for Africa, if Africa is to achieve structural transformation. And the AFCFTA clearly states in its objectives in the agreement that it aims to achieve structural transformation on the continent through creating a big market, regional value chains, industrialization, and building infrastructure, of course, in the area of transport, communications, financial services, energy, and so on and so forth. Right. So now, in order to achieve this structural transformation, we need all hands on deck. We need stakeholder ownership. We need governments to own the AFCFTA, to believe in it. We need industry, the private sector, to believe in the AFCFTA, to utilize it. After all, it's the private sector who really trade and invest, thus creating, you know, the much needed jobs for our youth, especially. Right, and we need civil society to own the process. There are other grassroots. We need academia, excuse me, academia, and the intellectual community to really own this process as well, in order to do the analysis, propagate the narrative that we need around the AFCFTA. So if we don't address the skeptics, we shall not have the roots or the basis on which the AFCFTA can stand and grow. So that's why we need to address the skeptics. But it's important to understand that the argument has largely been won. Ownership by the political leaders is really very high. Industry have organized themselves to make the most of the AFCFTA through associations such as Afro Champions. I'm sure you have heard of Afro Champions, African Business Council, the Pan-African Chambers of Commerce Industry. And at the regional level, the business councils or associations, they have all mobilized and they meet from time to time to discuss how to follow up trade and investment opportunities on the continent. And they are already doing so. In fact, as we speak now, trade is already happening. It was piloted in October 2022, just to demonstrate that the AFCFTA works. And since then, there are many companies that are already trading. Now, so the argument has been largely won. However, as Andrew was saying, once in a while, you hear some scathing attacks on the AFCFTA, both on the continent and also in the Western media, in the Financial Times, for instance, even in The Economist, though they had gone away from Africa as in a basket case to Africa Rising. But once in a while, you still hear these skeptical views being expressed. And these skeptical views are really poison, they can take away from the ownership that we need by governments, by industry, private sector, civil society, and academia. That's why it has to be vigorously challenged. And not just for the sake of it, but because it's fundamentally wrong. For instance, if you say that the African economy is small, that's wrong according to the facts. As we said, Africa as a whole is $7.4 trillion, at purchasing power parity, making it the fourth largest economy. We have just discussed how intra-Africa trade is quite significant, yet you hear a wrong narrative that it is still low, which can lead to wrong policy implications. So because this is patently wrong, it needs to be challenged. As Andrew was saying, you hear that it's a neoliberal project. It's not a neoliberal project. Neoliberalism is just about reducing border tariffs, customs duties, or about just opening up. The AFCFTA, as I have said, aims for structural transformation through regional value chains, through promoting industrialization, through mobilizing the private sector to make the most of the trade and investment opportunities which have opened up. So these narratives are wrong and therefore need to be challenged in order that the CFTA can play its rightful role over assisting to achieve structural transformation on the continent and in building the Africa that we want as an Agenda 2063. Right.
Thank you very much. And your book really, I would say that your book has really come at the right time to really address this. And I know I refuse because for me, some people like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Like, it's not going to work. And when you keep trying to, okay, look at this. Yes, there are challenges which everyone knows, but these are steps that are being taken. But we're hoping that with this and with your book, everyone, we get buy-ins, we get people to own it. We need to really own it for it to work as well. So moving on to the next question, I'm not sure if I should have to because Mr. Mold already mentioned his name. I was going to ask about how do we achieve greater economic integration and unity on our continent as proposed by the Nigerian economist Adebayo Adedeji and the Malawian economist as well, Sandika Mkandawire. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah,
Sandika
Mkandawire.
Yes.
Yeah, Mkandawire.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, if I may just start on this, I mean, because I work at the Economic Commission for Africa, Mr. Adebayo Adedeji, of course, was possibly our most famous executive secretary back from 1975 to 1991. And Adebayo Adedeji, of course, was formerly the Minister of Planning of Nigeria after the Biafran War. He was involved in the reconstruction of the country, but he also put very much at the forefront of his priorities regional integration. And Adedeji was instrumental, really, in the formation of ECOWAS at the time. And when he joined ECA, he continued with this agenda of promoting continental integration. At the time, ECA was instrumental in the formation of PTA, which became later COMESA in Southern and Eastern Africa. He was very much one of the people behind the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, and finally the Abuja Treaty of 1991, on which really is the framework which provides the general framework for the AFCFTA. So Adebayo Adedeji historically was a very important figure. But in the book, we actually just go through some of his writings and speeches as well, just to highlight the extent to which he thought about some of the challenges and difficulties with achieving continental integration and had answers for some of those challenges. So he's a very inspirational figure. Sandika Mkandawire, a Malawian economist who also passed away a few years ago, was also very inspirational. And he had a wonderful speech that he made in Cape Town in 2014, explaining why, like we try to in the book, there's not really much alternative to continental integration over the long run. He highlights, the Pan-African feeling that most African nationals feel about integration, but points out that the challenge is, transforming those sentiments into actual action on the ground. And he's a wonderful destroyer of myths about the difficulties of doing these things, because he really stresses the positives in terms of what's already been achieved by the regional economic communities, for example. And perhaps Francis would like to come in there as well, because that's another of the points we tried to raise in the book a lot about, the regional economic communities. Francis, of course, previously worked for COMESA. We stress that they should be the building blocks for the Continental project.
Yes, exactly. You're perfectly correct, Andrew. Yes. Yeah. So now let me just say, backtrack a little bit to the intellectual underpinnings of the FCFT. As you were saying, Andrew, we really try to highlight and build on the thinking of Professor Adibaya Adedeji and Professor Thandika Mkandawire as well, to make the point that we did not just pluck the FCFTA from the sky, or that it's not mimicking the European Union. There's some people think we just copy, the European Union. We try to show that actually this FCFTA has been long in the making. It has got intellectual underpinnings rooted in Pan-Africanism, going back to the 60s, even well beyond the 60s, and then into the 70s with the Thandika Mkandawiris and Adibaya Adedeji. So it is our own thinking. It's a homegrown project. Now, so to answer your question, how to make sure that we build the continental integration that we love so much and talk about, is first of all to go to the roots and to use the philosophy of Pan-Africanism, that we need to work together as a continent. In the book, actually, I was just saying that we go beyond the 60s. We try to point out how Africa had actually vibrant trade before it was divided up in 1885-86 at the Berlin Conference. And we try to show that, therefore, there was already a foundation for a borderless Africa, which has just was temporarily interrupted by colonialism, which of course we've got rid of now, and therefore should continue strengthening the borderlessness approach on the continent. And then now Andrew was talking about the regional economic communities. So the thinking or the philosophy of continental integration, of economic integration on the continent, is that we need to use the regional economic communities as building blocks. There has to be that incremental process. And the reason why is because Africa is so large, it is 30 million square kilometers. You can get the US, Europe, China, India, geographically, and they would fit all of them in Africa. So you cannot run out Africa out of maybe Addis Ababa or Ghana or out of one capital. You need an approach of subsidiarity, of using organizations on the ground. And in any case, if you are to be pragmatic, regional integration, regional economic communities are already thriving. They're already doing well in a number of projects, not just trade. ECOWAS, for instance, has had a long-standing program on peace and security, on movement of persons. The East African community is trailblazing well into the monetary union. It's already a common market. SADC has had these very strong programs on infrastructure, on industrialization. COMESA has got trade facilitation instruments, which are now being continentalized or replicated at the continental level. So they have a lot to contribute. And actually in the book, we try to show how, though contrary to what skeptics say, regional integration has been immensely successful across the world. Actually, most of this hype about globalization, about the World Trade Organization or multilateralism, promoting trade across the world, is really due to the regional integration initiatives, including South-South arrangements. So it's due to some methodological errors, analytical challenges that you get regional integration downplayed across the world. So that's the second thing that you need. But I also needed that you need regional economic communities. I wanted to make two more points, which we really devote extensive chapters to. We also need to make sure that in addition to talking about small and medium enterprises, which we do all the time, maybe too much, we need to talk more about the large enterprises. We really make this point quite strongly because large enterprises actually do the bulk of exporting, not only in Africa, but across the world. But on the continent, we seem to be shall I say, de-emphasizing or not talking enough about the importance of having large companies and promoting them, because it's these large companies which actually will bring about the regional value chains we talk about. They will be the umbrellas or the frameworks within which the small and medium enterprises will operate. It's large companies which really drive export trade, which drive investment, which we saw much need. These companies will also help to address this other problem, that we still have this challenge of commodity dependence. I think Andrew was just telling you about how exportation of oils, including by Nigeria, Angola, is still predominant in our country. Yes, so in order to address this problem of lack of diversification, in order to move towards structural transformation, we need large companies again. And this is an area that we also think needs due prioritization. We are working on it, but we need to continue prioritizing it rather than, beginning to forget about it or beginning to be drawn away from it towards more talk about SMEs, which is an important area, but we shouldn't forget the role of big companies and the importance of diversification away from commodity dependence.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, yes, I understand the fact about the big companies and they are going to be the drivers of it. But, this also means you still need to be supported. I guess that's why there's so much emphasis or priority on them. But let's moving on. I'm going to come back to Mr. Mangeni to answer this for us. Why do you think in your book you mentioned that the AFCFTA should have been called African Continental Market instead of a free trade area? Why is that?
Yeah, let me say something about this. Maybe Andrew will also come in because he likes this point very much, actually. He likes saying that.
Okay, so I'll let him chip in after you.
No, let me go on. It's fine. Yeah. So now, so as pointed out, the name Free Trade Area features in the words Free Trade Area feature in the name of the organization, the African Continental Free Trade Area. Maybe a bit of history. When we started negotiating it, it was actually just called the Continental Free Trade Area, CFTA. But then some people said, which continent are we talking about? So they thought we should specify that it's the African Continental Free Trade Area. So on top of the CFTA, we added AF to make it AFCFTA. But Omo, if you have tried pronouncing or saying AFCFTA, you will know how difficult it is.
Yeah.
So actually,
how to pronounce it.
So actually, across the continent, across the world, at all levels, from heads of state and government, to experts, to civil society, it's quite difficult. The acronym is quite difficult, really, to say or to spell out. Actually, there's a time where Andrew had said it's actually an ugly, acronym. I said we should have called it the African Continental Market. So that's the context. Now, the reason why maybe it could have been called the African Continental Market is because actually that's where we're headed. If you look at the Abuja Treaty, we're supposed to be building the African Economic Community eventually, which we're supposed to achieve by the year 2028. And then before that, the intermediate stage is that we're supposed to have the African Common Market. It's a common market. We're supposed to have a common market. So actually, common market is written in the Abuja Treaty, and that's why we're headed. Now, you look at the scope of the AFCFTA itself, it covers trade in goods, trade in services, competition policy, investment, intellectual property, digital trade, you see, women and youth in trade, dispute settlement. So that's much more than a free trade area, because conceptually, a free trade area simply covers removal of trade barriers to trade in goods. Goods, conceptually, the FTA deals only with goods, but you can see the FCFTA is actually much more than simply goods or removing barriers in goods. It goes into all these other areas that I've talked about: services, investment, competition, intellectual property, right? and so on and so forth. So that's why we make strongly the argument that maybe it shouldn't have been called just a free trade area. And of course, now calling it a free trade area has also now, it's like waving a red flag before a bull. It has led actually to this charge, to this accusation that it's a neoliberal project, that you see it's just a free trade area, which, as I have said, we vigorously challenge, that it's not at all a neoliberal project. So that's why we have this discussion around the name of the organization. But as I said, this is a thing that Andrew feels very strongly about. Maybe you'd like to come in.
So I'll just let him speak to it.
No, you explained it very well, Francis. You know, acronyms matter, don't they? Just because for the general public to remember things, the AFCFTA is a bit of a mouthful.
Okay, thank you for this. So I'm moving on to a very, very interesting question. I think this is one area that that's because it has not been addressed, why some people are skeptical about the success of the AFCFTA. That's the free movement of Africans within Africa. And people feel that if I can't move freely, I can't get visa within Africa. So what are you talking about? What are we saying about the AFCFTA? So, and in your book, you had mentioned that the free movement protocol, that's the AU free movement, which should not be an addition to the agreement, but a core component that's similar to the EU's principle that allows citizens the right to live and work in any member state. And I know that is one of the sort maybe should I call it a challenge, or why some of the countries, the African countries, are hesitating to actually adopt or sign that AU free movement protocol. Can you share more about this, Mr. Mould? So I'll start off with you now.
Actually, Francis was the lead author of the chapter on the free movement protocol, which is chapter 12 in our book. But I could just say, by means of introduction, you know, it's extremely important that if you want trade to grow, both goods trade and services trade, then you clearly need to facilitate the movement of people. That is the way that business grows. I mean, free movement is really the handmaiden of growth of trade. And across the continent, we see some positive initiatives, don't we? Within the East Africa community, you can travel using identity cards. ECOWAS, that's one of your achievements as well in West Africa. But we make the argument that it needs to go further. You know, so the fact that getting visas to so many countries is still very complicated, although there's been improvement in recent years, is going in the right direction. But ultimately, it needs to be a situation where, as an African national, you have a right and entitlement to go and work or study in other member states across the continent. And I hope to see a day where myself, as the person from outside the continent, I go to the slow queue where I have to wait for the visas, whereas the African nationals are just waved on through and go through quickly. It's not a small matter, really, I think, for the continent to give those sort of rights and entitlements. And we point out in the book that in Europe, actually, it's relatively recent as well. Only 30 years ago, did citizens of the European Union have the right and entitlement to go and live and work in other member states. But it makes a big economic difference. So this should be one of the drivers, I think, of continental integration, and African citizens would hugely benefit from those facilities.
So, Mr. Mangeni, do you want to chip in? Since you wrote the chapter on that.
Yeah, so we actually feel very strongly, Andrew and I, about this matter of movement of persons on the continent. In fact, there has been a clip on CNN, I don't know whether you watch CNN, Somo, where Mr. Dangote has been complaining about having to get visas, I think recently to Egypt. He said he was traveling to Egypt and it requires a visa to go there. I think there's a time he had challenges going into Angola, because of a visa problem. And yet he's bringing investment. So can you imagine how ridiculous that is? That there is someone who needs to move into a country. He's going to bring investment, create jobs, and then you're making it complicated for that person to get into the country. Or if you have just tried traveling around the continent, whether you're just an ordinary person like myself, or you're a business person, big or small, you know how a nightmare it is, especially if you are connecting across Africa from West Africa to Eastern Africa or
Absolutely.
Southern Africa. Yes, yeah. Sometimes you have to go all the way to Europe before you come back to Africa, or you have to spend 24 hours or 48 hours or for traveling, on a flight that could have taken maybe just 1 hour, just a flight across the border to a country, to a town across the border, and then you have to go to all sorts of other cities before finally coming back to where you want to be. So that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make business sense in terms of time lost, in terms of the cost. It wouldn't just make business sense at all. So this is a real bread and butter matter. It's a real issue. But so that's just the context. But I wanted to make the point that, first of all, I think we need to be accurate or realistic about the status of free movement on the continent. It is not as bad as many people like to portray it. Andrew was just mentioning ECOWAS, where I think there has been a program for free movement of persons for years.
Yes, that's
The
been
East
going
African
on for
community.
years.
Yes, the East African community is a common market where you can actually travel also using identity cards. And a number of countries, Rwanda, Kenya, have actually opened up their borders. You can go there without requiring an advance visa. And this has helped countries such as Rwanda to attract skills. Rwanda being a small country, which suffered a genocide, lost a lot of its population, more than 1 million people by some accounts. Right, so they needed to bring in skills. Small countries such as Seychelles also opened up, and this boosted their tourism as well. Of course, as well as Rwanda, visa relaxation has boosted the tourist earnings, right? And then you have organizations such as SADC, such as COMESA, which have got visa relaxation programs. So if you go to airports around COMESA, you will find desks called COMESA desk, right? Where COMESA citizens, SADC citizens go and they get expedited processing or better access terms to the country. So, and then you have got autonomous liberalization, and the African Development Bank has got this project called the Visa Openness Index, which is a flagship report which they put out periodically. And it shows how over the years, actually, countries have been relaxing visa restrictions or requirements across the continent. So I think we need to say it's not as bad as we like to say. But is it perfect? No, not at all. So that's why we really try to hammer home the point that we need to work on this as an integral part of the AFCFTA. The benefits, in addition to what I've been saying, skills, tourism earnings and things like that, include addressing skills mismatches, where in some parts of the continent, you have a glut of skills, lots of people who have skills, but they can't find jobs. And then in other parts of the continent, you have employers are looking for skills, but they can't find the skills that they need. Right. So we need this matches where, if there's a free movement of persons, these imbalances can be addressed. People can go where they are required, especially the youth who really need these skills. Now, before I end, I need to make a point here that there are again skeptics who say that we shouldn't have a free movement of persons because that will promote crime, that this will mean free movement of crime, that this will mean that people with diseases will come across the borders and kill off everybody else. So we make it a point in that chapter to set out that all these concerns, public policy concerns, whether they be security concerns, including crime, or public health concerns, have actually been addressed adequately in the protocol. Within the Free Movement of Persons protocol, there are safeguards that countries can resort to through their internal ministries of internal affairs, security persons, immigration personnel, public health officials, to control as appropriate inward movement of persons. So these safeguards are there, and actually we have tables of all these provisions which provide the safeguards. The other thing that we need to point out is that though the protocol on free movement of persons, right of residence and establishment, hasn't entered into force yet, under the African Continental Free Trade Area, one of the protocols is called the Protocol on Trading Services, which provides for the possibility of movement of business-related persons. For instance, under the Protocol on Trading Services, it's possible to have what's called movement of natural persons, like you and myself. Maybe we are going to do consultancy work, or we are going to do a contract in a country. We can move into a country as a natural person in order to do that work under the Protocol on Trading Services, which is in force. That's possible now. Secondly, there's also a possibility of what's called a company establishing a commercial presence. For instance, an investor. Such a company can come with its staff, with its employees. So it's called the intra-corporate transferees. And then thirdly, it's possible also to do what's called consumption abroad. So where people go abroad in order to consume services, such as they go out for tourist purposes as tourists, or they go into a country as students to consume education services. So under the Protocol on Trading Services, there is a possibility of movement of persons as well, which is already available now, and it's the protocol is in force and can be used. Having said that, we need to use the best practices from the AFCFTA, which enabled this Protocol on Trading Services, and of course all the other protocols, to enter into force quickly, to make sure we have the Protocol on free movement of persons to enter into force. That protocol is still useful, even if we have the Protocol on Trading Services, because that protocol covers persons, all persons, even if you are not going to do business at all. It also provides for the possibility of having an African passport. And when you have an African passport, it's prohibited to require a visa on somebody who is carrying an African passport. Yeah, so those are benefits under the Free Movement of Persons Protocol, which we should still aspire to get.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Mangeni, taking us through the modes of services supply on the trading services. So let's quickly moving on. I'll just ask, you said in your book, you also mentioned that the AFCFTA should not be overburdened with unrealistic expectations, as it's not the solution to all of the continent's developmental challenges. Can you address that? Because there's been so much like, oh, AFCFTA has come to answer it all. AFCFTA is the key, AFCFTA is this and that. So can we just quickly speak to that? Thank you.
Yes, Omobola, I think, the reason we stress this in the book is there's just this concern that it's not an easy thing to create a continental market. Africa's geographically an enormous continent. We have a lot of AU member states. And there needs to be a degree of focus to make this agreement work. So the problem for me personally is I see the agenda around the AFCFTA growing all the time. So people are talking about, climate resilience and the environmental impact of the trade agreement. They're talking about labor rights standards sometimes. They're talking about things which are definitely very, very important. But you could argue that is the AFCFTA the best way to achieve those objectives, or should we have national policies in place to address some of the challenges? So at this stage in the agreement, I think we need an overpowering focus, particularly on making the goods trade work initially, liberalization, so countries respect the tariff reduction schedules, and they remove the non-tariff barriers to intra-African trade. The services agenda is also extremely important. but is rather more complex because liberalization in services is not the same thing as liberalization in merchandise goods, because it's a regulatory matter often that requires changes to national laws. So even with those two parts initially, it's it requires a lot of effort on the part of member states. So basically, at the end of the book, we just end with a plea, like, let's not expect the AFCFTA can resolve all the developmental challenges of the continent. It doesn't absolve member states from their own responsibilities to deal with a lot of those challenges. But we do argue that it would make for a much stronger collective African economy if the AFCFTA is fully implemented. So that's the basic tone of the argument. Francis?
Yes, exactly. So, so we make the point that the AFCFTA doesn't mean that governments no longer have their traditional roles to play in national economic development, in addressing national issues, whether they relate to gender, to children, to environment, to labor, all the things that governments must continue to deal with. So we say, even if we have the AFCFTA, it doesn't mean that governments should stop doing that work. They must continue to do that work. The AFCFTA doesn't absolve them from that work. And then we also point out that the AFCFTA is already so much. Andrew has just mentioned goods and services. But of course, as we have all been pointing out, it has investment, it has competition, it has intellectual property, it has digitalization, it has women and youth in trade. That's already a lot, on the plate of the AFCFTA. So the agenda of the AFCFTA is really broad, and an attempt has been made to make sure it's comprehensive enough to address the trade, investment, and industrialization nexus, which is required for socioeconomic transformation. So all that's required in order to achieve this socioeconomic transformation has been taken care of, at least from the trade and economic perspective. So that should be appreciated. Now, having said all this, of course, people are allowed to get excited about the AFCFTA. There's no stopping that. And people are allowed to leverage on the AFCFTA to talk about the ripple effects or the knock-on effects, to see how the AFCFTA can help achieve other objectives. For instance, people talk about the AFCFTA as an enabler of peace and security. For instance, through addressing the structural causes of conflict. When we create jobs, when youth are employed, then we deal with this problem of despondent young people who are prey, who are easily recruited by terrorists and things like that.
Thank you.
Yes, and then yes, and then I need to make this point as well. And then this consistent pressure that we need to make sure that the AFCFTA deals with the environment. We don't go into detail on this because we make the point that we shouldn't overload the AFCFTA. But whenever we get the opportunity, we clarify that the AFCFTA is already green enough. So we don't need this pressure that we need an additional protocol on the environment. We can say the AFCFTA is green enough because it has provisions for environmental goods. Even if you are talking about critical minerals, they are there in the harmonized system. We have got environmental services, as well as other services which help deal with the environmental issues. Under the protocol on investment, we have got provisions for green industrialization. It's possible for governments to give incentives to promote green industrialization. Under the protocol on intellectual property, we have got provisions for promoting emergent technologies and the new technologies, which help to deal with the greening or transition to the fourth industrial revolution. So the AFCFTA is green enough, and you can do environmental programs within the existing provisions rather than overburdening it with additional new provisions. And in any case, there are already lots of other organizations on the continent around the world which are dealing with all these other issues, whether they are labor issues or environmental issues. So partnerships are there, where they are being concluded, and they will be required and they will be helpful, but without loading everything onto the AFCFTA as the panacea for all problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. I absolutely agree with both of you that we shouldn't overburden. So moving on, I just want to get, can you just share, what do you think about the GTI launch in Nigeria? And now that Nigeria has joined, is it going to make any difference? Is it going to contribute to the rapid implementation of the AFCFTA? So maybe I can have Mr. Mold speak on that, and we'll just talk about recommendations generally to wrap up the interview. Thank you.
I think Francis has actually been following the GTI much more closely than I have. I could just give you one anecdote, though. We were recently in Cameroon, and we were the port authorities of Douala. They were explaining that they were trying to import some cement from Nigeria under the AFCFTA, and they weren't able to because I think the rules of origin certificates on the Nigerian side weren't yet ready. So they weren't able to import the duty-free imports there. So I think that's a good example, and it's very important that Nigeria is now undertaking the GTI, and we hope to see Nigeria trading much more with the rest of the region as the AFCFTA is rolled out.
Okay, Mr. Mangeni, do you want to do a very quick one on GTI launch in Nigeria?
Yeah, so it's a welcome development. I was a co-chair of the preparatory process for the launch of the GTI in October 2022. Now, we meant it to be a pilot project to demonstrate that the AFCFTA works. We always knew that the AFCFTA works. But again, this idea of skepticism, people were saying, oh, what's happening? You remember, we're just emerging. We're in the thick of COVID, actually. So though we're in the thick of COVID, people were still expecting things to be happening. So we said, yeah, well, we're still in the COVID, but you can trade if you want. So we wanted to demonstrate that it works. It worked. Now, we started off with 7 countries, an 8th one joined. And the second edition, which we are going to hold in October this year in Rwanda, we expect to have 39 countries. And of course, Amazing. It's really good that Nigeria has joined. Yes. Now, there are just 2 clarifications to make. If you look carefully at the official communication from the government of Nigeria, the federal government of Nigeria, also from South Africa, which also piloted it, we call it preferential trade. Nigeria joins preferential trade under the AFCFTA. South Africa joins preferential trade under the AFCFTA. There's a reason for that nuance. And the reason is this, that trade under the AFCFTA can happen on all goods where we have rules of origin. And it's practically all products except just about 9% of these products. Actually, we have rules of origin on 92.3%. We have rules of origin on these products. So trade can happen in any of these products. This is important to clarify because there are some people who think that you can only trade on the AFCFTA using GTI, meaning the 8 countries or the 39 countries, hopefully, which we shall be having in October this year. And that it's only for countries like in the case of Nigeria, countries to which they have exported to, in products which they have exported to. So you keep on exporting the same products you have exported during your pilot phase. No. After you have piloted it, it's now open to export any product to any African country, any of the African countries where you have rules of origin and countries, of course, which have ratified the AFCFTA. So this is a very important clarification to make, because if we continue talking about GTI as the only framework for trading on the continent, we deny people opportunities who would have exported other products, many products to other countries, to many other countries. So I wanted to suggest that, therefore, what it means for Nigeria is that they have now shown that they can issue a certificate of origin. Nigeria can issue a certificate of origin. And it can process an export consignment, and that its products can be maybe accepted in various countries where Nigeria has exported. Therefore, the Nigerian business community should be able to come up with any other products and then try to export them wherever there is demand for those products, any products. Yeah,
Thank you for that clarification.
It's an
It's
important
very important that you clarified that it's not just a duty. So in wrapping up, I'm just going to ask for any recommendations, maybe just like 60 seconds from Mr. Ward and from you, just to wrap up recommendations. And then, so because I know Mr. Ward really needs to go soon.
Yes, I think one thing we try to stress in the book is about the importance of people understanding that this is an initiative for African citizens. It's not just for, you know, specific interest groups, whether those are small cross-border traders or small companies, or for exporters or for manufacturing firms. The idea is to give benefits to everybody. And we stress very much, for example, when we discuss the free movement protocol, that young people would be the largest beneficiaries for free movement, both through opening up new opportunities for work and also educational opportunities across the continent. And I think it's important going forward that we frame things in this manner. You know, how does the average African citizen benefit? Through liberalizing trade, we should see more competitive markets. We should also see lower prices for a lot of consumer goods and services across the continent, for example. And I think if we adopt that optic and prioritize the programs and aspects and elements of the AFCFTA which bring the biggest benefits to the citizens, then I think it will prosper. So that's one recommendation I would make. Yeah, put the people first in the process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Mr. Mangeni, your recommendation?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a role for everyone. There's a role for government. There's a role for industry or private sector. There's a role for academia, and there's a role for civil society, including people like yourselves, Ms. Omo. What you're doing now, we need to continue to educate the public, to put out the information out there so that the public can make the most of the AFCFTA, trade and invest across the country, across the continent, so that they get all the incomes that they need in order to prosper as individuals, as families, eventually as communities, and of course, as countries, and as the whole continent. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you so much to Mr. Mold and Mr. Mangeni. It's really been an amazing time. I wish, yes, we could have extended, but you know, they are really busy, and I know how it took them out of their tight schedule to really get them to be here today. And I really appreciate their support for this, for the Trading Without Borders podcast, and also to, you know, to spread the word about the AFCFTA. That's what I have been doing with the podcast, to educate people, to get applicants, to prepare ourselves to leverage the opportunities of the AFCFTA. And I really want to appreciate both of you for joining me today. I do not take this for granted. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much, because I know you are really busy, but I had to get both of you to be here today. It was in between your tides and all of that. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.